Hello, everyone. So this week, we are back in Ionia to talk about Heraclitus of Ephesus, who is one of the most fascinating philosophers of the ancient times. He has influenced people right from Plato and the Stoics all the way to Hegel and Nietzsche and even Marx and Lenin and Heidegger, like on the other side. So he has had this continuing influence on Western philosophy and was a fairly fascinating sort of thinker, and would be at any time, I think. He is not in the same line as the other Ionians, so I did say we are back to Ionia, but you will be disappointed or maybe glad, depending on what you expect from Ionia, to realize that he is pretty different from the Milesians, the Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, whom we have talked about before. Different from Xenophanes as well, though not absolutely. There are a few things where there is a critique, but yeah, fairly different from Xenophanes. And very different from the Pythagoreans. But there are points of similarity. Anyway, I will stop talking generally about this. So who was this fellow, Heraclitus of Ephesus? So as I said, Ephesus is in Ionia, Asia Minor, Anatolia, Turkey, whichever way you want to think about it, geographical location. Flourished around 500 BC, so his flood width is supposed to be around 500 BC. We have approximate dates. As I said, they're always approximate for most of the philosophers, from about 535 BC to about 475 BC. So that's the approximate sort of period of his life. What we do know about him, or we guess we know, is that he was of high aristocratic birth, and that he abdicated his throne. So he was in line for a hereditary kingship of Ephesus. So Ephesus apparently had hereditary kingship. And he was in line for the throne, and he abdicated to his brother. And so you have Diogenes Laertius mentioning it, saying that, this was quoted as a sign of his arrogance. And he was considered to be this kind of an arrogant, misanthropic, anti-democratic as well to some extent, this kind of a misanthropic, arrogant and depressed philosopher. He's often called, Heraclitus the Dark, Heraclitus the Obscure. These are the names that are given to him. So and you will see why he has this sort of a reputation. We'll see soon enough. He did not get along well with his fellow citizens. So he said something like, Ephesians, that is his citizens, so they deserve to be hanged to the last man, right? Everybody. And they should leave the city to the boys, to the children, since they drove out the best amongst them, this, what was his name? Hermodorus. So they drove out Hermodorus, saying that let no one be the best amongst us, right? Let no one be the best amongst us, and if there is one that is the best amongst us, we shall kick him out. This is one of the fragments we have from Heraclitus. So he did not get along well with his fellow citizens. In fact, he had this thing about, kingship should be given to children, sort of a thing. There's another fragment where he says, lifetime is a child at play, moving pieces in this game of chance. And kingship or rule, belongs to a child. Again, this idea of, we as adults become incapable of ruling, of making of being good rulers. It should be given to children. He has a reputation, as I said, for being slightly misanthropic, slightly sort of anti-democratic, thinking of he said something like, one man for me is 10,000 if he be the best. So this idea of there is an aristos, and that's something to be aspired to be the best. But the best in what sense? We will talk about that. But this idea of there being someone who is the best. He was very critical of his predecessors, and we have a lot of fragments which are pretty fun to read, I think, where he's criticizing his predecessors. And he says things against Homer, against Hesiod, against Archilochus, which could be seen as a critique of the poetic outlook, but then, we need to know what exactly it is, because the thing with Heraclitus is that he wrote in this very fragmentary manner, or rather that's what we have. But even the fragments that we have, the way he writes, and it's purposeful. It's not like, it's just because, with Anaximander, maybe he wrote very clearly, but we didn't have that many fragments. But with Heraclitus, with whatever fragments we have, he is very obscure. He, even in the old time, he was called Heraclitus the Riddler. He had the idea of being the Riddler, the obscure fellow, and he's doing it on purpose. We have fragments where he actually says that, I don't want everybody to understand me, and I'm writing. You guys, you will read my book. The introduction to his book, that's fragment 1. I'll read it out to you in a bit, where he says something like, most people will not understand what I'm saying anyway. So I'm writing for a few. And in fact, Nietzsche later I think picks up on this sort of attitude, saying that you guys will not be able to digest what I write. I forgot which book it was. Maybe it was The Gay Science, or one of the books where he starts with, you guys will not be able to digest what I write, but I will write it for those who can get something out of it. In fact, let me see if I can find fragment 1, where he says, so although this account that I'm writing, it holds forever, men ever fail to comprehend. People don't comprehend what I'm writing, both before hearing it and once they've heard. So even before they hear it, they don't understand this account, which has held forever. But, even before I said it, this was true. You did not understand it then. And even after I tell you, you don't understand it. Although all things come to pass in accordance with this account, men are like the untried when they try such words and works as I set forth, distinguishing each according to its nature and telling how it is. So I'm explaining everything properly, but people are like untried and they are completely confused. But other men are oblivious of what they do awake, just as they are forgetful of what they do asleep, right? So again, you have this idea of people not being able to comprehend what he has said, and even it was said before he said it. So he's not claiming that he's the first to say this. He's saying that this has been true forever, but people did not understand it then. Now I'm putting it forth to you clearly, but you still will not understand it. So if this was really the introduction to his book, it's a pretty challenging introduction that, if you read my book, don't expect to understand, because most people, you guys, you're not going to get what I'm saying, kind of an attitude, right? So he was very critical of the ancient philosophers, and he did not mince his words. So he said something like, so we have this fragment where he says, Homer deserved to be thrown out of the competition. So you had these poetry competitions where people would go and recite poetry, and Homer's poetry was recited in some competitions by rhapsodes. And it's pretty interesting because he says, Homer deserved to be thrown out of the competitions and beaten with a rhapsode stick, right? The word he uses for the stick is rhapsine, I think that's the word. Let me just check if I can find it. I'll check it later. So the idea of, Homer deserves to be beaten with a rhapsode stick. And Archilochus likewise. Now, Archilochus is somebody who would have criticized Homer as a rhapsode, and Archilochus was also a poet. So you have this, chain of critique going from Homer to Archilochus to, he's like, all of them kicked out, and they all should be beaten with the rhapsode stick. So, critiqued with their own tools, sort of a thing. So yeah, but not very nice, right? He deserves to be beaten. Who says that? Then he says, so we have this, this is a testimonia from Polybius, that he said that in taking the poets as testimony for things unknown, they are citing authorities that cannot be trusted, right? So this is a testimonia, which is why the style is a bit more direct and simple. I think probably Polybius is paraphrasing. Basically, do not trust poetic authority. Now, this is similar to what Xenophanes said earlier. But, this idea of Homer deserves to be thrown out, Archilochus likewise, and do not trust, these authorities. And people who go to the poets to understand the world, to understand the cosmos, they're doing wrong. Then another fragment, he says, we should not listen like children to their parents, right? So just like children listen to the parents, and parents can say whatever, and children ask them and they listen and they believe it. Well, I'm not sure how much they do, but yeah. In the same way, we should not be, treating these poets as our parents and listening to them and believing them. Then he has one fragment, one more famous one, which goes into, like, it relates also to his theory of awareness and understanding. But he says, eyes are surer witnesses than ears. The immediate understanding you can get from this fragment, I suppose, is that things that you see, that you perceive immediately, are you should trust them more than things that you've heard and rumors and ideas. So eyes are surer witnesses than ears. Like a very banal kind of immediate meaning as well out here. Although with Heraclitus, you will see that one meaning is difficult, which is why maybe he's so popular even now, because you can read him again and again and draw new sort of conclusions from it. It's all very fragmentary and poetic in a different way, not in the way that we have been talking about in mythopoetic, but in the sense of with lots of wordplay, puns, so there's a lot of that going on. And sometimes, two meanings, very ambiguous phrasing, so two meanings can be derived immediately. This is something that Aristotle, for example, didn't like. So Plato did like him. So Plato also had this penchant for wordplay. And, he would say something like pausanias pausomenoi, in the Symposium. So Plato did like doing wordplay. So I suppose that's why he appreciated Heraclitus's wordplay as well. But Aristotle was like, no, I don't approve of this. He cannot speak clearly. He confuses everybody. So he had this penchant for wordplay. But there are two meanings. One is the immediate banal meaning, which we should also not let go of, and then there is a more complex meaning. So here the hoi polloi comes in. So he says, what wit or understanding do they have? They believe the poets of the people and take the mob as their teacher. Yeah, not knowing that the many are worthless. Hoi polloi kakoi. The many are bad, worthless, evil, and good men are few. Oligoi de agathoi. Only a few are good. So you can see this, again, this slightly anti-democratic stance out here, that, the public, the mob opinion, the popular opinions, like very sort of you could take it as anti-populist, or you could take it as anti-democratic, whichever way you want to see it. But the idea that you don't go around believing the popular opinion, don't go around believing these poets of the people, Homer and Hesiod. And Pythagoras as well, he doesn't like him. Don't go around believing these people who become extremely popular. The eyes are surer witnesses than ears, sort of a thing. So he was, as you can see, critical of the poets and of the popularity of the poets especially. He was also somewhat anti-Ionian, also anti-Italian outlook. Pythagoras was, a special, so there are many mentions of him sort of attacking Pythagoras. So, a special place in his sort of irritation with other people. So he says, much learning does not teach understanding, for it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and in turn Xenophanes and Heraclitus. And Xenophanes is a contemporary, so he's attacking not just people before, but people right then as well. So it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, who did not learn much. They learned much, but they didn't get much understanding. And Xenophanes and Heraclitus, I think, was a geographer or historian of the time. So did not teach any of them. So again, this sort of special attack on all these people. Another one where he says about Hesiod, says, Hesiod is a teacher for many people. They hold that he knows many things. He who did not know day and night, for they are one. Right? And we will look at this fragment again when we talk about his idea of opposites and harmony of opposites and equality of opposites. But again, he's attacking Hesiod, particularly saying, so many people say he knows so many things, but he doesn't even understand that day and night are one. They are in a cycle. They're not like two different creatures. Like with Hesiod, you'd have, Hemera is different and Nyx is different. And in fact, Hemera comes from Nyx, if I remember correctly. I can never remember the theogony of Hesiod. It's too complex. But they are not different. They're just one and the same. And people are going and listening to Hesiod. What kind of idiots they are. That's what Heraclitus is trying to say. In fact, he has this very sort of evil and cruel story about Homer. Although he got his own back with other people making such stories about him as well. So he says, men are deceived in their perception of manifest things, very much like Homer, who was the most wise of all Greeks, for he was deceived by children killing lice, who said, the things that we have seen and caught, these we leave behind, but the things that we have neither seen nor caught, these we take with us. So apparently this is one of the apocryphal stories about Homer's death, which is probably blatantly untrue. Where it's believed that Homer sort of, was told, don't go to that island, you will die, out there. But like, of course, as soon as somebody is told that, they want to go there. So he goes there, and then he sees these children on the beach playing, right, with something. So he goes to them and he asks, okay, what are you doing? And so what are you taking? What are you carrying with you? So they say, the things that we have seen and caught, these we leave behind, and the ones that we have neither seen nor caught, these we take with us. And this is a riddle, as you can see. And Homer was supposed to not have been able to figure out this riddle because he was not very clever, and he would not look at what Heraclitus is saying. He could not see what was in front of him, because what were the children doing? They were killing lice, so he could see that, but he started thinking about the riddle because he's too clever and much learning. So with his learning, and he never managed to solve it, while the answer was just manifest right in front of him, because the children were killing lice, so the answer to this was lice. Right, so it's a pretty cruel story about Homer as well. But you can see the kind of critique that he's trying to bring forth against them. Pythagoras, as I said, special place with his sort of irritation. So he says things like, Pythagoras was a prince of impostors. Then you have another one where he says, Pythagoras pursued sort of knowledge. And we've talked about this in our previous sort of lecture on Pythagoras, where he says, Pythagoras pursued knowledge further than all others, right? Choosing what he liked from these compositions, made a wisdom of his own, much learning, artful knavery. This line, much learning, artful knavery. He's just trying to fool people into believing that he understands things. So he's gone and picked up lots of different information and put them together, but he has no understanding of any of them. And another fragment, last one that I'll quote on this, he says, much learning does not teach understanding, for it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras and Xenophanes and Hecataeus, which I've already quoted. But this again, the same idea of much learning and you don't get understanding from it. So now let's sort of talk about who Heraclitus was, where he was from. We've already said Ephesus, but we have this testimony, I think this is from Diogenes Laertius as well, where, let me just sort of find it. He talks about a story like Heraclitus gave for Homer. We have such stories circulating about Heraclitus as well. Obviously, again, not true, but they like to make fun of each other by saying things like this, right? So we have Heraclitus, son of Bloson, or according to some of Heracon of Ephesus. This man was at his prime in the 69th Olympiad. He grew up to be exceptionally haughty and supercilious. So, again, this reputation for arrogance. As is clear also from his book, in which he says, and this quote that I gave you about, much learning does not teach, or sort of, much intelligence. Finally, he became a misanthrope, withdrew from the world, and lived in the mountains, feeding on grasses and plants. So he got really annoyed with his Ephesians, about whom he said they should all be hanged to the last man, and he abdicated his kingship, and then he went to the mountains and lived there and ate herbs. And however, having fallen in this way into a dropsy, so apparently he got dropsy because of just eating herbs, he came down to town and asked the doctors in a riddle if they could make a drought out of rainy weather. When they did not understand, because he was talking in riddles, here, as I said, he has a reputation for talking in riddles, he buried himself in a cow stall, in cow dung, that is, expecting that the dropsy would be evaporated by the heat of the manure. But even so, he failed to effect anything and ended his life at the age of 60. Right, so pretty horrible death imagined for him, buried in cow dung, but probably not true. But again, a cruel story circulated at that time. So there was a mention of that book, a book in that fragment. So we have another testimonial for this book, where we have this testimonial where he says, the book said to be his is called On Nature. Peripousios, that same sort of title, Peripousios on Nature, which comes back from its chief content, because these are names that are given. I mean, it's assumed that they were given afterwards to books. I mean, Heraclitus might have given it himself, but it's assumed that these names were given afterwards, and is divided into 3 discourses. On the universe, politics, theology, so it has 3 parts. He dedicated and placed it in the temple of Artemis, as some say, having purposely written it rather obscurely. So as I said, this testimonial says purposely written obscurely, so that only those of rank and influence should have access to it. So everybody will not be able to read it or understand it or even appreciate it. And it should not be easily despised by the populace. This hoi polloi kakoi, should not have access to this book of Heraclitus. This was the idea. The work had so great a reputation that from it arose disciples, those called Heracliteans. So, rather than immediate disciples, the disciples come from his obscure book, which is pretty appropriate, I would say. Yeah. What we do have of this book, we don't have this book, right? Nothing is extant. What we do have extant is like a set of fragments which may not have been part of a book. It may have been part of a book, but it might just be a set of sayings, collected together posthumously. And in this book, he basically talks about, as you saw, the 3 sections named are Peritupantos, about everything, about the universe, about politics, politikon, and theologikon, about theology. So, and you'll see that the fragments can actually be divided into these parts. So we will, we'll talk a bit about, I'll do a different division when we talk, which I think most commentators on Heraclitus actually tend to do that, to put the fragments in a particular way and then to figure out what's being said. So just to conclude on this. So he was called, as I said, the weeping philosopher or the melancholic philosopher. He was also called Heraclitus the obscure, Heraclitus the riddler, as I already said, Heraclitus the dark. Why? Because of his oracular style. In fact, before I conclude, I'll also talk a bit about his style, his oracular style and his method of knowledge. And his extensive use of metaphors. Already you saw, there's like life is a game of chance, Homer should be beaten with a rhapsode stick. So you have this sort of, use of metaphors. You have this brevity, very sort of, concentrated, complex, sort of crystallized thought, and this very in brief fragments, like 5 words of Heraclitus, you could start thinking about it and trying to figure out what's going on. So, almost like a lyric poet of later times, or of earlier times, in fact. Use of paradox, there's a lot of paradox, and he's trying to also talk about paradox, so you can see where that comes from. Very, very sort of, cryptic, obscure, symbolic, sometimes you're just like, okay, what does this symbolize? And the problem with symbolic sort of writing is that we are not of that time, so it becomes like doubly, triply, many a times puzzling for us. Very sort of, suggestive and subtle. Often enough, things that he says, like, kingship belongs to a child, okay, cryptic sort of as well. And there's this combination of, this arrogance, Homer deserves to be kicked out, much learning does not teach understanding, but also this humility, it's like, but, you will not, nobody knows, this is not my account, this account has always existed, kind of a thing. And this strong contempt, as you can see with, the way he talks about Homer, Hesiod, and Pythagoreans and everybody. This strong contempt for what he would think of as claims to wisdom, this wisdom, claims to wisdom without knowledge, this idea that, you have much learning and not understanding, kind of a thing. And you will see that unlike the other Milesians who were experimenting and trying to figure out with observation what's going on, his conclusions are based on they're more intuitive. He's a bit of an intuitive kind of a philosopher. And you can see more of an element of observation, like this intuition of the world rather than observation and analysis of data that you can find in the world. And in this way, he's pretty different from the other Ionians and also actually very different from other philosophers of his time as well. And he was somewhat, in fact, we don't know like whether he was taught by anybody. In fact, he says that I learned from no man. You know, he had this kind of an isolation, not just from his fellow citizens, but from everybody, from fellow philosophers. So like very isolated, sort of obscure, dark kind of a figure, with this claim that I learned from nobody, I learned from no man. Now, the kind of position that he's trying to take and the kind of style that he's using, as I said, was very oracular. And in fact, the few people that he has something nice to say about, you know, is the oracle, the Sibyl. So he says, he talks about the Sibyl, and he says that she has a raving mouth, of course, you know, because she talks like a mad person. And she says things that are mirthless, unadorned, and unperfumed, right? But she says things that are direct, you know, mirthless, unadorned, unperfumed. And her voice carries through 1,000 years, you know, because of the God who speaks through her. Because the Sibyl, this oracle who speaks, it's a God that speaks through her. And that's why her voice carries through 1,000 years. And she says things that are mirthless, unadorned, unperfumed, you know, not very beautiful things, but like they're true kind of a thing. Another one where he says, and this one is one of the very sort of, as I said, you know, confusing, subtle, and suggestive ones, very suggestive ones, where he says, the Lord, whose temple, whose oracle is at Delphi, so that is Apollo, neither speaks nor conceals, but signals. Right? Now, what does that mean? He neither speaks nor conceals, but signals, and that signal should allow you to understand for yourself. In fact, he later says, and we'll look at that as well. He says, "I searched for myself." You know, the knowledge comes from within. You know, the God or nature or anything simply signals. It doesn't try to tell you anything. It doesn't try to hide anything. Right? It's there. It gives you a signal, you have to search it, right? It's this focus on self-search that sort of is part of the philosophical methodology. So the Lord sort of does not conceal, but we still have these things in which you have fragments where he says things like nature loves to hide, or hidden harmony is better than manifest harmony. You know, so you have something like things are not really obvious all the time. You know, things are hidden, and in fact, he also has this idea that we, as humans, are capable of seeking knowledge, and we ought to, in fact, seek knowledge. But you know, when we seek, we will not necessarily find a lot. So he has one where he says, "The ones who seek gold dig a lot and find little." But you still have this idea that yes, you have to dig a lot and you have to search a lot, but you will still find a little gold. You know, but you have to seek gold. Then. He also has this idea of the limits of human sort of capabilities and the limits of knowledge as well. So he says, you will not discover the limits of life by walking, you know, through this road of life, even if you travel the whole road of life, you know, because it has such a deep sort of discourse, such a deep account. The word logos, we'll talk about logos, in fact, next. So such a deep sort of, you know, account, discourse, you know, sense to it. So he has this again, this idea of there is no limit to knowledge, and we as humans will seek much but find little, sort of a thing. So what is his philosophical method? So his philosophical method, as I said, you know, this very famous fragment where he says, "I searched for myself," right? "I looked for myself." Now, what could this actually mean? So one meaning that you could get is that, you know, we ourselves, like, you know, everything tends to hide to some extent, to conceal, but neither conceal nor speak, the Lord, for example. So there is we ourselves are a riddle, you know, and the world around us is a riddle, and our relation to the world is a riddle. So to search for yourself would be to solve the riddle of yourself and of the world around you, of your own nature and the world around you. Then to search for a discourse, this logos that he talked about, you know, to go to even if you travel the whole road, you will not discover, you know, the limit, because it has such a deep logos. Now, what is this deep logos? So to discover this logos, which is this sort of, you know, this one truth, this knowledge that we can pursue, which we can seek, and we can grasp as well. So, but of course not entirely. There are some limits to our sort of capabilities. And then you can also think of it as I went and searched for myself. I went to look for myself. I sought to discover my real self. What is my real self? I asked questions about myself. I searched for myself. I asked questions about myself. I asked myself, and I asked questions about the world to myself. And whatever questions I asked, of course, I treated the answers as riddles. I treated the answers as something that don't, don't sort of, sorry, I'll just find the quote. Don't speak nor conceal, right? They signal, even in myself. So basically what he is then making himself is that he's making himself a kind of oracle, who signals. And that's why his style is also very oracular. You will notice that his style is very oracular, and he is trying to signal, like he does speak, but neither speaking nor concealing. Although, there is one follower of his, Heraclitus, who just signaled and did not actually speak at all. So we'll discuss the statement, you cannot step into the same river twice. And this Heraclitus said, well, actually, if you think about it, given that everything is changing all the time, you cannot step into the same river even once. And that means that anything that I say, the words cannot hold meaning which is fixed. Everything keeps changing. So I cannot actually even speak, because whatever I say, it'll change as soon as I speak it. So he stopped speaking at some point in his life. He spoke before about not speaking, and then he said, well, anything I say, it's never going to stick around anyway, so I will not speak. And he used to just signal. Right, he would signal, and that was what he used to do to his students. So maybe that's what I should do to you guys as well. Unfortunately, I speak, and it's all recorded and stored for posterity. But yeah, so in the next video, we will talk about the concept of logos, or account, word, and it has many meanings for Heraclitus. Thank you.